The mop bucket tipped before I saw the shoe that kicked it. Gray water fanned across the marble in a shape like a wing, and the man in the $4,000 suit didn't stop walking. He didn't even look down. "Watch where you're ringing that thing," he said to the air above my head, already 3 strides gone, already forgetting I existed. I was on my knees with a rag before the elevator doors finished closing on him. 2:17 in the morning, and I was 31 floors below where I used to sit at a desk with my name on a brass plate, wiping somebody else's carelessness off a floor that would never remember my face. The night doorman called me hey when he wanted the trash bins moved, and nothing at all when he didn't. That was the whole shape of my life now. Nobody notices the mop, Hale. That's the job. The building manager had said it to me on my first week like it was a kindness, like he was saving me the trouble of hoping. I want to tell you it didn't still land somewhere soft in my chest every single time. It did. I just didn't let it show on my face anymore. I'd gotten good at that. 4 years of practice will do that to a person. If a story like this one has already gotten its hooks into you this early, do something about it now. Subscribe to the channel so you don't lose your place in what happens next. My name is Juno Hale. I was 29 years old, and 3 years and 2 months earlier I had been a forensic accountant with a corner office at Langley and Finch, the kind of omega who got asked to double-check the partner's math because mine was never wrong. Then, a senior partner named Desmond Price moved $11 million through 4 shell companies with my initials forged on the transfer authorizations, and by the time the dust and the lawyers finished settling, I had no license, no references, and a father's pocket watch in my coat pocket that I wound every night out of habit, even though it hadn't ticked since the morning he died. 4:17. That was where the hand stopped. I still don't know if it was AM or PM. I never asked the coroner. Some numbers you don't want confirmed. I mopped floors at Meridian Tower from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and during the day I did the books for a bakery 2 blocks from my apartment for cash under a card table, because nobody checks references for cash. I told myself the numbers didn't miss me. That was a lie I was getting better at telling. The alarm went off 9 minutes after the man in the suit ruined my mop water. Not a fire alarm. The low, ugly klaxon that meant a car had stopped between floors, the kind that made the night doorman's face go the color of skim milk. "Corner office elevator," he said into his radio, voice cracking. 41's stuck, she's in it. Everyone in that building knew who she was without asking. The whole tower had been built around the fact of her the way a cathedral is built around an altar. Adrienne Voss, the Frost of Meridian, the business papers called her, and they meant it as a compliment to her enemies' fear and an insult to everything else about her. 34 years old, sole heir to a shipping and holdings empire her mother had built out of nothing and colder rules, and in 6 years at the helm she had never once been photographed smiling at a stranger. She had also, according to the doorman, turned down 11 arranged matches in 18 months, which was the kind of gossip that traveled through a service elevator faster than any stock report. I didn't think about any of that while I was running toward the freight elevator with my radio and my flashlight. I thought about counterweights. I found the object of the whole company kneeling in trapped dark 31 floors up, cut off from the fire panel, because I flagged it before the response team wasted 4 minutes finding it, and the story pivoted there, on that landing, on the sound of my own voice steadying someone else's. The car had stalled between the 40th and 41st floors, cable tension reading wrong on the panel, power cut to the whole shaft as a safety default. Through the comm line, I could hear a woman's breathing, even deliberate, the kind of controlled breath that costs more effort than panic does. "This is Adrienne Voss," she said, like she was still running a meeting. I need someone who knows what they're doing, not someone who's going to read me a manual. The fire team's junior tech looked at his radio like it had grown teeth. "Ask her how many people are in the car," I said. He asked. "One," came the answer. "Ask her if the car dropped or if it's holding level." "Holding, miss," Voss said herself, cutting the tech out entirely. "It hasn't moved in 6 minutes. Who is this?" I hadn't meant to be handed the radio. Somebody handed it to me anyway, because I was already doing the math the tech wasn't fast enough to do. Dead weight, cable slack. The difference between an elevator that would hold until sunrise and one that was seconds from a controlled drop that wouldn't be gentle. "My name is Juno," I said. "I clean this building. If the car's holding level and the cable tension reads at 60%, it means the safety brake caught. That's good. That means you're not falling. It means we have time, and time is the only thing we need right now." "How do you know the tension reads 60%? "Because your maintenance panel logs to the lobby board, and I read it every night, whether anyone asks me to or not." There was a pause on the line long enough that the tech looked at me like I'd said something dangerous. "Keep talking," she said, not a request, an order, low and even, the kind of voice that assumed obedience because it had never once had to ask twice. "Tell me what you're reading now." I talked her through 11 minutes of numbers, floor counts, break percentages, the exact worn language of a system I'd taught myself to read out of loneliness more than usefulness, while the real technicians reset the shaft power in stages behind me. When the doors finally parted on the 41st floor, she stepped out under her own power, spine straight, not a hair out of place, and looked directly past 4 firefighters and her own head of security to find me. She was taller than I'd pictured from 3 floors below on a bad radio connection. Dark coat, no tie, the kind of stillness that made a room quiet itself without her raising her voice. When she got close enough I caught it, cold rain on granite, and under that, something darker, like vetiver crushed underfoot. It hit some old, unused part of my brain like a struck match. "You," she said, "the one who reads panels no one asks her to read." "Juno Hale," I said, because it seemed the numbers had earned me my name back for one conversation. "I clean the East Wing." Her eyes went to my badge, my gray uniform, the mop cart abandoned 4 floors below with somebody else's spilled coffee still drying on it. Something moved behind her expression, quick and private, gone before I could name it. "Not anymore," she said. "Come to my office at 9. Then she turned and walked into the dark of the executive floor like the last 11 minutes had cost her nothing at all, and I stood there in my gray uniform with my radio still warm in my hand, smelling rain on stone long after she was gone. I didn't sleep before 9. I sat on the edge of my mattress winding a watch that would never tick again, and told myself it meant nothing. A rich woman's impulse, gratitude with an expiration date. I was wrong about that, the way I would turn out to be wrong about almost everything I assumed that week, but I didn't know it yet. At 9 o'clock exactly, Adrienne Voss's assistant, a soft-spoken older man named Mr. Okafor, who moved like he'd learned patience as a professional skill, led me past a floor of assistants who stared at my uniform like it was a stain they hadn't ordered cleaned, and into an office with a view that made the city look small enough to hold. Adrienne didn't stand up. She looked at me the way she must have looked at a balance sheet that didn't add correctly, like a problem worth solving. "Tell me," she said, "what a forensic accountant is doing mopping my lobby floor." I went very still. "How do you know what I used to be? I had someone pull your file at 6 this morning. Langley and Finch, $11 million, 4 shell entities. Your name on the wire authorizations you swear you never signed." She folded her hands on the desk. I don't offer positions on instinct, Ms. Hale. I offer them on proof. You gave me 11 minutes of proof last night. I'd like 11 months of it in my internal audit division, starting today. I don't have a license anymore. I don't need you to have a license. I need you to have eyes. A pause, brief and deliberate. I have a company with numbers in it I don't trust, and a floor full of people who've never once looked at the woman running this building's mop cart and wondered what she used to be able to see. I thought about the watch in my coat pocket, stopped at 4:17, and I thought about a man named Desmond Price, whose name I hadn't let myself think in 3 years, and something in my chest that had gone quiet a long time ago sat up and started paying attention again. All right, I said. I'll take the 11 months. She almost smiled. Almost, Mr. Okafor will get you a badge for the 14th floor, she said. Welcome to Voss Meridian, Miss Hale. I didn't know yet that the 14th floor was 2 doors down from Desmond Price's office, or that he'd changed his last name's spelling and his suit size but nothing else about the way he moved money, or that the woman who'd just hired me back into my own life would, before the year was out, put her whole empire on the table for a person the world had trained itself not to see. I only knew that when the elevator doors closed behind me that morning, for the first time in 3 years, I caught myself checking my reflection in the brass, and I looked, for just a second, like someone who mattered. The 14th floor smelled like new carpet and old money, and everyone on it looked at my visitor badge the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth you're too polite to mention. My supervisor for the audit division, a woman named Priya who ran meetings like air traffic control, gave me a desk by the copier and a stack of vendor invoices that had been flagged, unflagged, and reflagged 3 times by 3 different junior analysts who'd each quietly quit the account within a month. Nobody wants this one, Priya admitted, sliding the folder across. Every time someone digs into Sable Harbor Logistics, they find nothing. And every time they find nothing, Mr. Price tells the board the case is closed, and the analyst gets reassigned somewhere with a worse view. I opened the folder anyway. I'd learned to read invoices the way some people read faces. For the tell, the half-second where the number doesn't sit right in its own sentence. Sable Harbor Logistics billed Voss Meridian for freight services on a route that, according to public shipping records, hadn't run in 14 months. The invoice was signed off by a name I hadn't seen in 3 years, spelled with an extra E he must have added sometime after he ruined me. Desmond Price. My hands went cold before my face did. I didn't say anything to Priya. I photographed the invoice with my phone and put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, because I had learned, expensively, what happened to omegas who accused powerful men of theft without every single number already lined up like soldiers. That was the week the small kindnesses started, so quiet I almost missed them being kindnesses at all. A cup of tea appeared on my desk on my 3rd afternoon, chamomile, with a curl of dried orange peel floating in it, exactly the way I'd once mentioned, offhand to Mr. Okafor while waiting for an elevator, that my mother used to make it that way before she died. I hadn't told anyone else that in this building. I hadn't told anyone else that in 3 years. Miss, Voss asked the kitchen to keep it stocked, Miss, Okafor said, when I asked, like it wasn't strange at all that the coldest CEO in the financial district had memorized a stray sentence from an elevator lobby. I saw her twice that week, both times in passing, both times in a hallway too full of other people for either of us to say anything that mattered. But she looked at me the second time. Really looked, the kind of look that took inventory, and I felt it land somewhere under my ribs like heat from a stove I hadn't noticed I was standing near. "You're still here," she said, the first time we spoke since the office. You're still avoiding the elevators, I said, before I could stop myself, and something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of amusement, if amusement were a country she still had a passport for. Only the ones you're not driving, she said, and walked on. And I stood there in the hallway with my heart, doing something inconvenient and unprofessional. Wealth, up close, doesn't announce itself the way I expected. It's quieter than that. It's the floors that don't creak. It's the way security waited for her without being told to. It's the fact that when I finally saw the executive dining room, the tablecloths were so heavy, they didn't move in the draft from the air vents. I had grown up 2 rooms and a hallway from a laundromat. I understood, walking those floors, that Adrienne Voss and I came from entirely different countries, and that the visa she'd handed me could be revoked the moment she remembered that. By the second week, I had built a private ledger of my own, off the company servers, cross-referencing every Sable Harbor invoice against public port records, tax filings, and, because old instincts don't die, they just wait, Desmond Price's personal spending patterns, which had gotten considerably more expensive in the 18 months since Sable Harbor started billing. I didn't tell anyone. I told the watch in my pocket instead, winding it every night like it could hear me. Desmond found me on a Thursday, alone in the archive room on the 11th floor, pulling 5-year-old shipping manifests I had no official reason to need. Well, he said, from the doorway, and I felt my whole body go still the way it used to before a partner meeting he was about to ruin. He hadn't changed. Heavier through the jaw, grayer at the temples, the same smile that used to mean I was about to be handed someone else's mistake to sign for. Juno Haley. I heard the mop girl got a badge. I didn't believe it until I saw the file. Desmond. It's Desmond Price Ashford now, he said, like the hyphen was armor. Married well. You'd know about that, if you'd kept your license instead of losing it over $11 million you swore you never touched. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell cologne trying too hard to cover something sour underneath it. I'd be careful, digging around in archives that aren't your department. People who go looking for old ghosts sometimes find out the ghosts are still very much alive and still very much capable of ruining a career a second time. Is that a threat? It's a memory, he said. I'd hate for you to forget how the last chapter ended. He smiled the way a locked door smiles. Enjoy your tea, miss. Hale, I hear it's chamomile. He knew about the tea. That detail sat in my stomach like a stone the rest of the day, not the threat, which I'd half expected the second I saw his forged signature on Sable Harbor's invoices, but the fact that he'd noticed something that small, which meant he was watching me closely enough to notice everything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the watch in one hand and my private ledger open on my laptop, and I understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 3 a.m, that I had walked back into the exact fire that burned my life down once already. Except this time, I had a badge on the 14th floor of the one company powerful enough to survive burning Desmond Price Ashford to the ground, if I could prove what I already knew in my bones to be true. I just didn't yet know whether the woman who'd hired me would believe me over a man who'd married into her board. I found out 4 days later, and it went worse than I could have imagined. Priya called me into a conference room I'd never been in, the kind with a table long enough to seat a small country, and I knew before I sat down that something had already been decided without me. 2 people from security stood by the door. Desmond sat at the head of the table like he'd been there the whole time, waiting. $12,400 is missing from the petty disbursement account tied to your badge access, Priya said. And her voice had the careful flatness of someone reading from a script she hadn't written. I've never touched the disbursement account, I said. I audit vendor invoices. I don't have transfer authority. Your badge does. Desmond said, not looking up from his folder. And I understood then, with a cold, sinking clarity, that he'd built this the same way he'd built the case against me at Langley and Finch, quietly, patiently, months in advance, waiting for the exact moment I got close enough to something real to need silencing. The door opened before Priya could say anything else, and Adrienne walked in the way weather walks into a room. Everyone stood. I didn't, because my knees weren't entirely reliable at that moment. "Explain," she said, to no one and everyone. Desmond explained. He was good at it, measured, sorrowful, a man reluctantly doing his duty. He used the words pattern of concern and understand the sensitivity given her history, and I felt each phrase land like a slap I'd already survived once and apparently hadn't finished paying for. Adrienne's eyes found mine across that endless table. I wanted her to ask me. I wanted, more than I'd wanted almost anything in 3 years, for her to look at me the way she had in the elevator shaft, like my word alone was worth 11 minutes of trust. "Suspend her access pending investigation," Adrienne said instead, voice giving away nothing. "Standard protocol." The words landed somewhere under my sternum and stayed there. "Adrienne," I started. "Miss Voss," she corrected, quiet and final, and I understood in that single syllable exactly how much ground I'd imagined between us that hadn't actually existed at all. I walked out of that conference room with my badge in an envelope and Desmond's satisfied silence following me down the hall like smoke, and I did not cry until I was 3 blocks from the building, standing at a bus stop in the rain, holding a watch that had stopped telling time long before anyone in that room had decided I couldn't be trusted with the truth. I didn't hear from Voss Meridian for 6 days. I mopped other floors during that stretch. D, my closest thing to a friend on the night crew, covered my old lobby route without being asked, sliding an extra sandwich into my locker with a note that just said "Eat, dummy," because Dee's love language was blunt instructions and stolen cafeteria food. I told her everything, sitting on upturned buckets in a supply closet at 4 a.m, and she said what I needed someone to say. That woman looked you dead in the eye and let a rich man throw you away rather than risk her own board seeing her hesitate. That's not confusion, Juno. That's a choice. Don't build a house on a choice like that. I believed her. Mostly, I told myself I believed her completely. The storm came on the 7th night, the kind that turns a city into static, power flickering in whole blocks, and I was home alone rechecking my private ledger for the 100th time. Because grief needed somewhere to put its hands, and mine went to numbers the way other people's went to prayer, when someone knocked on my apartment door. I opened it, expecting D. I found Adrienne Voss standing in the hallway, rain in her hair, no security, no assistant, no armor at all except the coat she hadn't bothered to button. "How did you find my apartment?" I said, because it was easier than asking, "Why are you here?" "I've had your file since the night you talked me down from a stuck elevator," she said. "I read it again tonight." All of it, Langley and Finch's internal review. The Sable Harbor account audits from before your termination. Your CPA board hearing transcripts. She stopped, and something in her jaw tightened like she was holding a door shut against her own weather. I should have read it before that conference room instead of after. You suspended me. I bought you 6 days where Desmond couldn't touch your access logs while I quietly had forensic it trace the actual transfer, she said. It didn't originate from your badge. It originated from a workstation cloned to mimic your credentials, routed through a maintenance account that only 3 people in this building can authorize. One of them is me. One of them is my head of security. The third is Desmond Price Ashford. I stood very still in my own doorway, watched cold in my fist, and felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for 3 years. You believed me. I believed the 11 minutes in that elevator shaft, she said. I should have believed them the second Desmond opened his mouth. Instead, I let a boardroom teach me to doubt the one person who's never once given me a reason to. Her voice dropped, rough at the edges, in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Not command, something closer to confession. May I come in? I'm not asking as your employer. I stepped back from the door, and she came in out of the rain, and the whole small shape of my apartment, the mismatched chairs. The watch collection I couldn't afford to fix, the marigolds dying slowly on the windowsill, because I never remembered to water anything but other people's problems, sat exposed under her attention like a confession I hadn't meant to make. She noticed the watch first. Of course she did. Your father's, she said, not a question. He died when I was 22. Heart. Sudden, no warning. It stopped the same morning, like it decided to go with him. I turned it over in my palm. I wind it every night anyway. I don't know why. You do know why, she said gently, and for the first time since I'd met her, gentleness didn't sound like a performance. You wind it because stopping feels like losing him twice. I looked up at her, rain still drying in her hair, granite and vetiver filling my small kitchen like weather of its own, and understood I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't take a single step back from. Why did you really come here tonight? I asked. You could have sent this in an email. Adrienne Voss, who had turned down 11 arranged matches and never once, according to every gossip column in the city, explained herself to anyone, looked at me like the answer cost her something to say out loud. Because I have spent 6 days telling myself this was about the fraud, she said. And it isn't only that. She confessed the rest of it slowly, sitting at my chipped kitchen table with tea she hadn't asked for going cold between us, the story coming out of her like something long held under pressure. Her mother, Eleanor Voss, had built the company out of a divorce that gutted her and had raised Adrienne on one doctrine repeated so often it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like law. Control is survival. Want is a door left open. Adrienne had believed it completely, right up until she was 26 and fell in love with an omega named Sophie, quietly, the way you fall into things you've been told your whole life not to trust, and Sophie had been paid, in the end, by a rival firm angling for a hostile position on the board to leak 8 months of confidential merger data before disappearing with the money and never once looking back. The stock dropped 11% in a day, Adrienne said. My mother didn't say I told you so. She didn't have to. I said it to myself every morning for the next 8 years. She looked at me, unguarded in a way that made my chest ache. Every match my family's found me since has come with a due diligence report longer than most merger contracts. I turned every one of them down. Because a report can't tell you whether someone will stay when staying costs them something. And I don't come with a report, I said. You come with an elevator shaft and 11 minutes of the truth, she said. That told me more than any report ever has. I don't remember deciding to reach across the table. I remember her hand was cold from the rain, and mine was cold from 3 years of being careful, and when our fingers finally touched it, felt less like a beginning and more like something that had already been happening for weeks, quietly, underneath everything else. Tell me to stop, she said, low, and I will. Don't stop, I said, and meant it with my whole ribcage. We didn't do anything that night beyond that, beyond her thumb tracing slow, careful circles over my knuckles, beyond her forehead resting against mine for one long, unhurried minute, while the storm rattled my one good window. But I understood, sitting there with her scent settling into the walls of my apartment like it belonged there, that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be undone by a boardroom or a badge in an envelope. Her phone rang at 11:40. I watched her face change before she even answered it, the softness folding itself back into armor in the space of a single breath, a transformation so complete it made my chest hurt to witness. "Say that again," she said into the phone, voice gone flat and cold as the night outside. A pause. Her eyes found mine, and for the first time since she'd walked into my apartment, I saw real fear behind them. "I'll be at the office in 20 minutes. "What happened?" I asked, already standing. "Celeste Thorne just gave an interview to 3 business outlets," Adrienne said, pulling her coat back on with hands that weren't quite steady. "About my judgment, about hiring an accused thief with a documented history of embezzlement and letting her into my building, my files, my life. It runs online in 6 hours. She looked at me, and the apology in her eyes was the worst part of all of it. "I have to go fight this publicly, or the board will use it to force a vote by Friday. I need you to trust that leaving right now isn't the same as leaving you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to, standing there in my kitchen with her scent still warm on my skin, and I told her I did, and I meant it as much as fear lets anyone mean anything. She kissed my forehead once, quick and certain, and walked back out into the storm, and I stood at my window watching her car pull away and told myself this was different from the last time someone I trusted let the world convince them I wasn't worth defending. I was wrong about how bad it would get before it got better. Celeste Thorne's interview ran at 6 in the morning exactly as promised, and by 9 it had a headline on every business page in the city. "The Frost of Meridian's blind spot. Has Adrienne Voss lost her judgment over a disgraced accountant?" There were photographs of me leaving the tower the night of my suspension, my face caught mid-flinch, captioned like evidence. There was a quote from an anonymous board source calling it a liability the company can't afford. There was Celeste herself, poised and sorrowful on camera, saying she only wanted to protect the family she'd hoped to one day belong to. Dee found me on my kitchen floor at 10 a.m., laptop open, article after article loading like slow-motion wreckage. "You're not going to spiral on tile," she announced, hauling me up by both arms. "Spiraling requires a couch, minimum. Have some self-respect." "They're going to force her out because of me," I said. "Or they're going to make her choose, and I already know which way a board votes when a company's stock is bleeding." "Then give her something better to choose with," Dee said. "You've got a ledger, don't you? You've had one this whole time." I did. 6 weeks of quiet cross-referencing, a private trail of shell companies and phantom shipping routes that led, every single time, back to Desmond Price Ashford's signature, the same forged invoice architecture he'd used against me at Langley and Finch, refined, scaled up, and hidden inside a company 3 times the size. What I didn't have was proof he'd cloned my badge credentials, and without that piece, I had a compelling story instead of an unbreakable case. "Mr." Okafor called at noon, voice careful. "Miss, Voss asked me to tell you she's requested access logs from it directly, bypassing Mr. Price Ashford's department." "She also asked me to tell you," he paused, like the sentence had been hard for her to hand him, "that she has not and will not disavow you, whatever the board decides Friday." It should have comforted me more than it did. Instead, I spent the afternoon watching Desmond's car pull up outside my building through the gap in my curtains, watching him stand on the sidewalk across the street for 11 long minutes, without ever crossing, just looking up at my window like a man confirming an address for later use. That night, someone broke the lock on my building's mailroom and went through the tenant boxes. Mine was the only one emptied. Dee's building superintendent found mine crumpled in the alley the next morning, torn open, everything gone except a single grocery flyer, left behind almost like a message. I understood the message. He was telling me he could reach anything of mine anytime, and that the badge in an envelope had only been the opening move. I packed a bag that night. Not to run, I told myself that over and over, standing at my dresser with my hands shaking, just to be ready, the way I'd learned to be ready 3 years earlier, when the ground had opened once already, and I hadn't seen it coming until I was already falling. I held the watch in my palm and thought about how thoroughly a person could lose the same life twice, and I let myself cry for exactly 4 minutes, because that was all the time I had ever learned to give myself for grief before I had to get back up and function. That was where Adrienne found me, Marisol Reyes, her head of security, at the door first, scanning the hallway like a soldier clearing a room, Adrienne 2 steps behind her, both of them soaked from a rain that hadn't let up in 2 days. Someone accessed the building's after-hours logs an hour ago using Price Ashford's credentials, Marisol said, no preamble, already moving to check my windows. He knows where you live. We need to move you tonight. Move me where, I said. So he wins by making me disappear. No, Adrienne said, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before, not the boardroom cold, not even the gentleness from my kitchen table, but something harder and more certain underneath both of them. So we finish this before Friday's vote instead of after it. I need everything you have, Juno. Every file, every date, every shell company. Tonight. I looked at the woman who had let the world make her doubt me once already, standing soaked in my doorway with her security chief bracing the hall behind her, and I made the only choice that had ever actually worked for me in this life. I trusted the numbers, and I trusted her enough to hand them over. We worked through the night at my kitchen table, the 3 of us, papers spread across every surface, Marisol running names against public filings on a laptop, while I walked Adrienne through 6 weeks of cross-referenced fraud with the same steady patience I'd once used to talk her down from a stuck elevator shaft. By 4 a.m. we had it, a complete architecture, Sable Harbor Logistics, and 11 other shell entities, all routed through the same maintenance account Desmond had used to clone my badge, all funneling money into accounts traceable with 2 more days of legwork directly to Celeste Thorne's family holdings. They're not just covering for each other, Adrienne said, staring at the pattern laid out across my table like a wound finally lanced. They built this together. The interview wasn't about protecting the company. It was about making sure nobody looked here before Friday's vote handed him a permanent seat and her a merger. The knock at my door came at 4:40, and it wasn't gentle. Desmond stood in the hallway with 2 men I didn't recognize, and an expression that had finally, completely, dropped every pretense of civility. I want the files, Hale, he said. Whatever you think you've built, hand it over now, and we can still make this go away quietly. The way it went away before. It's not going away, I said, standing in my own doorway, watch cold and solid in my closed fist. Not this time. He moved fast for a man his age, faster than I'd braced for, hand closing hard on my wrist to drag me forward, and Adrienne was between us before I fully registered him crossing the threshold, taking the shove meant for me square across the shoulder, hard enough that I heard the crack of her hitting the doorframe. Touch her again, Adrienne said, low and absolutely level despite the pain plainly written across her face, and I promise you, the board vote will be the least of what you lose. Marisol had Desmond's men handled inside of a minute, security training meeting men who'd clearly never planned on resistance from anyone in that apartment. Desmond himself stood frozen in my doorway, staring at Adrienne with something like disbelief, like he genuinely never imagined the Frost of Meridian putting her own body between danger and a woman who mopped floors. I saw something come alive in Adrienne's eyes then that frightened me a little. Not rage exactly, but its older, colder cousin. The look of a woman calculating exactly how thoroughly she could end a man's life without breaking a single law. "Adrienne," I said, quiet, and put my hand flat against her chest, over the spot where I imagined her heart had to be racing despite every outward stillness. "Don't become something you'll hate on his account. He's not worth what that would cost you." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her shoulders came down from wherever it had climbed. "Get him out of this building," she told Marisol, voice steady again, "and get everything we found to legal before sunrise. Friday's vote is going to happen a great deal sooner than Friday." By the time the sun came up over my ruined mailbox and my kitchen table full of evidence, we had a case airtight enough to survive a courtroom, and Desmond Price Ashford had a warrant with his name on it instead of a board seat. The emergency session was called for the following morning, and word had clearly traveled because the boardroom held twice the chairs it usually did, and every one of them was full. I stood at the back near the door in the only good blazer I owned, watch in my coat pocket, while Adrienne stood at the head of that long table and, for the first time in 6 years of running the company, did not stand alone. "6 weeks ago," she said, addressing the room like she was reading a verdict, "I suspended a member of my audit team on the word of a man who has spent the last 2 years defrauding this company through 11 shell entities, using the exact forged signature method that ended her previous career at Langley and Finch. I was wrong to suspend her. I am not going to be wrong twice." She nodded, and I stepped forward. I had spent 3 years believing no room like that one would ever let me speak in it again, and my hands were not steady as I opened the file, but my voice was, because numbers had never once lied to me even when people had. I walked that boardroom through Sable Harbor logistics route by falsified route, invoice by forged invoice, showed them the cloned badge credentials, the maintenance account only 3 people could authorize, the wire transfers threading straight into accounts belonging to Celeste Thorne's family trust. I showed them the same fraud architecture from my old firm, side by side, an unmistakable signature no honest lawyer could argue away. Desmond stood up halfway through, face gone the color of old paper, and made it 4 steps toward the door before the 2 officers Marisol had stationed there stepped forward. "Desmond Price Ashford," one of them said, "you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and forgery." The silence in that room after the door closed behind him was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Celeste's name followed within the hour, her family's holdings frozen pending investigation, her carefully sorrowful interview quoted back at her by 3 different reporters within the day. The board that had been ready to vote Adrienne out on Friday spent that same afternoon voting, unanimously, to formally clear my name and reinstate my credentials with full back pay. Adrienne found me afterward on the observation floor, the one with the view that made the whole city look small enough to hold, and she didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood beside me looking out at a skyline that had almost cost us both everything. "I have spent 6 years being told that love is a door left open for someone to walk through and take everything," she said finally. "My mother built an empire on believing that. I built a career avoiding proving her right." She turned to face me fully, and every ounce of the Frost of Meridian was gone from her expression, replaced by something raw and entirely unguarded. "You are the first person who has ever made me want to leave that door open anyway." "Why me?" I asked. "Because I needed to hear it. Because 3 years of being invisible had left a hunger in me that wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than specifics. "Because you read a maintenance panel no one asked you to read," she said. "And you kept reading, floor after floor, invoice after invoice, for 6 weeks, with nothing to gain and everything to lose. Because it was true, and it mattered, and no one else in that building would have bothered. Because you wind a watch that will never tick again, out of love, not habit. Because you see the whole room, Juno, even the corners nobody looks at." Her voice dropped, rough and certain. "You saw the corner of the room nobody looked at for 3 years. You saw me in that elevator shaft before you had any reason to believe I was worth seeing at all. Tell me to stop," she said again, softer this time, her hand rising to rest against the curve of my neck, thumb tracing slow along the place where my scent gland pulsed. "And I will." "Don't stop," I said, for the second time in a week, and meant it with everything 3 years of invisibility had left in me to give. When she kissed me, the whole observation floor filled with the smell of warmed fig and brown sugar tangled through granite and rain, and somewhere behind my ribs, for the first time since I was 22 years old, I felt something that had stopped a long time ago start, very quietly, to move again. The bonding happened 4 months later, in the garden behind Eleanor Voss's country house, under an arch of marigolds Adrienne had planted herself the week after learning they were my mother's favorite flower, a detail I'd mentioned exactly once months earlier, in a hallway too crowded for either of us to notice the other memorizing it. Eleanor herself stood at the edge of the small gathering, sharp-eyed and silent through most of the ceremony, and it was Marisol who finally leaned toward me afterward, arms crossed, gruff as ever. "In 9 years working security for that woman," she said, "I have never once seen her wait for anyone. Not for a car, not for a meeting, not for anything." She nodded toward Adrienne, laughing at something Dee had said, radiant in a way the business papers would never have believed possible. "She waited 11 minutes on a stuck elevator for a stranger's voice on the radio, and she's been waiting for you ever since. Don't waste it." I didn't intend to. The claiming came that night, private, unhurried, every step of it asked for before it was taken. "Tell me to stop," Adrienne murmured against the curve of my throat, her voice unsteady in a way I'd only ever heard once before, in my kitchen, in the rain. "I mean it, Juno. Say the word, and I will." "Don't stop," I said. And this time there was no fear left in it at all, only certainty. Only her name in my mouth, like something I'd been waiting my whole life to be allowed to say out loud. The bite, when it came, was gentle and absolute, and the bond that opened between us afterward felt less like something new, and more like a room in my chest I hadn't known was there, finally getting its lights turned on. Desmond Price Ashford pled guilty 8 months later to 14 counts of securities fraud and forgery, and is currently serving 11 years without possibility of early release, the judge, reading the pattern of his crimes against 2 separate victims a decade apart, called it one of the most deliberate financial predations she had presided over in 20 years on the bench. Celeste Thorne's family trust was dissolved entirely. She left the city within the year and has not, as far as anyone in Meridian Tower has heard, been welcomed back into a boardroom since. My CPA license was reinstated within 6 weeks of the board's public statement, backdated, with a formal letter of apology from the very licensing board that once stripped it from me without a second hearing. I run internal audit for Voss Meridian now, from an office 2 floors below my wife's, with a brass nameplate that has never once been mistaken for anyone else's. Dee still works the night crew, though these days it's by choice rather than necessity, because apparently mopping floors at 2 in the morning with your best friend is a habit worth keeping even after the rest of your life changes completely. The watch sits on our nightstand these days, fixed at last by a horologist Adrienne, tracked down in a city 3 states away, its hands moving steadily forward through every ordinary morning we get to share. I don't wind it out of grief anymore. I wind it because some mornings I like to watch time simply keep going, the way I once wasn't sure mine ever would again. I used to believe that being overlooked was simply the price of being who I was, too careful, too quiet, too easily replaced by anyone willing to smile wider in a room full of people who'd already decided not to look. I don't believe that anymore. I believe now that there is always someone capable of noticing the corners nobody else bothers to check, and that being truly seen once by the right person is enough to rebuild an entire life around. The end. If a story about being overlooked and then finally fully seen found its way into you the way it found its way into me while I wrote it, subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you too. I'd love to know in the comments, would you have handed Adrienne your trust the moment she showed up soaked in your doorway? Or would you have made her earn every last inch of it first, the way Juno did? Tell me where you landed. Until the next story, take care of the people who see the corners nobody else looks at. And stay close, because there's always another one waiting just around the corner.